Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with two very special guests, Nikhil Krishnan, Strategic Partnerships at TrialSpark, and Malay Gandhi, Business Ops at Evidation Health, as well as an investor in the healthcare space. Both back by popular demand for round two. Nikhil, Malay, welcome back.
Thanks, Erik.
Awesome.
Happy to be here.
Awesome. Nikhil, you recently gave a talk about how the speed of innovation in healthcare is changing thanks to new tech entrants. You talked about infrastructure changes. You talked about AI-first companies. You talked about patient experience as a business model. Why don't you unpack some of the main points you were trying to make in that slide deck?
Yeah, sure. So I think there are a few kind of big themes I want to talk about. The first was how the infrastructure to start a healthcare company has basically gotten much better. And now, even if you just look 5 years ago versus today, just the number of sort of services that are available to start a healthcare company has just totally exploded. And it's now much easier than ever to basically start a healthcare company, which I think is really good for the space. The second thing is basically about how you have these new kind of AI native companies. So, I mean, generally, when some disruptive new technology comes around, it's not actually that interesting until you see really cool new workflows and business models that are hard to replicate. And so really starting to see a lot of those companies get built now. And then patient experience, which is this kind of like meme buzzword that like everyone kind of just like throws around randomly in the industry. I think you're starting to see really interesting ways that it actually can be a defensible business model. And so those are sort of the three kind of interesting trends that I've been following in the healthcare space right now. And I think it's also just important for anyone who's interested in how the speed of innovation and change is happening in healthcare startups. I think it's important for kind of everyone to know.
And if you're giving this same talk, 3 years from now, what do you hope is different or changed or evolved, or how do you see it playing out?
I think it gets even easier over time to start a healthcare business, and as it should. In my head, one of the things that healthcare kind of severely lacks is this long tail of small, medium-sized businesses in kind of every part of healthcare, because those small, medium businesses become early adopters for the next wave of companies, etc. Right? Like in enterprise tech land, you always have these other startups that you basically pilot your service with, and then you scale up, etc. Healthcare kind of lacks that. You almost have to immediately jump to like the largest player in the space to get an anchor customer, etc. It's cool now that we're seeing like the first wave of like digital health companies actually become customers now of this new wave. So, for example, like Oscar is now a customer of a lot of these APIs as a service companies. So I'm hoping as this ecosystem kind of gets more built out, there are more customers and more early adopter cohorts where you can really, really have just faster speed of experimentation. So really hoping there are more like SMBs in this space.
That's a nice segue into Malay. You wrote a blog post 3 years ago called Building a Big Health Tech Company. We talked about why we haven't really seen the types of unicorns in healthcare that we were expecting at the time. Maybe unpack a little bit what you were trying to do with that blog post, and then you can discuss how 3 years later, where are we?
Yeah, I think the core sort of thesis of that piece was that if you looked at a lot of the companies that decided to serve the industry, working in like provider IT or payer IT and so on, they had a really challenging time actually building substantial businesses. And the argument was that you were sort of scraping pennies off of penny scrapers to start with. And so it was hard to build scale. And if you wanted to think about building a company in this space, it wasn't, I didn't use the terms, but essentially to build companies that would have, I guess people would describe as full stack. And I would argue just having much more control over the value chain, and then specifically in healthcare, trying to solve some of the principal agent problems. So rather than working through intermediaries and middlemen, help those who actually spend money in the healthcare system take more agency over that spend, or for individuals their own health. So that was kind of the central premise of the piece. I think in the ensuing 3.5 years, whatever it's been now, have been relatively interesting. I think there was a long IPO drought between now and then. Actually, like there wasn't actually that many companies that went public, and then there's been a handful of IPOs this year. I think I'll give Nikhil a shout out. I think he described it as the Beast Coast. So the big acquisitions in health tech, neither were out of the Valley. So Flatiron, I think, was one of the largest exits actually in New York venture history. It was sold for about around $2 billion to Roche, and then PillPack was sold to Amazon for somewhere around $1 billion, something in that range, out of Boston. And I think, look, I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but I think Flatiron is best described as like a high performance oncology network. They use software to create a network of oncologists that were able to have higher performance. And then they were, obviously monetizing in the pharma space. And PillPack was directly cited, in the piece as a company that had gained some control over their value chain as a pharmacy, and I think had ambitions of moving further into that value chain, including as sort of distribution for other companies, and even potentially becoming a PBM and taking on more risk. And I guess we'll see what they do with Amazon. So I think that's like one side of it. We have seen a couple of pretty interesting outcomes, one to a legacy pharma company, and then one into a new sort of like a big tech company or a new healthcare entrant. So those dynamics have been interesting. And then the IPO drought broke sort of this year. Probably the two I was most interested in were Livongo and Health Catalyst. Livongo is like a company that's grown really, really quickly in this sort of chronic disease management, or some people call digital therapeutics space. I'm not going to use the term they use to describe themselves because I don't think it's a real category, but that was interesting to see. One of the first sort of disease management companies that was in the B2B2C space go public, were they able to create that model, and they were ahead of many other companies that actually started before them. And then Health Catalyst, I would say, is more exactly what, as an investor, you've come to expect out of a lot of healthcare companies. It's like half software, half services. You're plodding along, doing these huge sort of large scale deals with incumbent healthcare companies, hoping it blends together into a reasonably scalable business. So I think it was good to see those couple IPOs this year. The other thing, like the third piece of when I was looking back at the piece, was around the IPOs, like the companies that had went public during that time. It's interesting to look back now of like which companies have done well and which haven't. So Fitbit and Evolent have tanked, like not doing well as businesses. And then I think Teladoc has done, surprisingly well from my view. And then Health Equity is the other one, that they're in like the health savings account space. And so if I think of those four companies, Fitbit and wearables, consumer wearables, Evolent and value-based healthcare, Teladoc and telemedicine, and Health Equity and sort of consumerism, telemedicine and consumerism did really well, and value-based healthcare and consumer devices didn't do so well. If you think of them as like sort of pure play opportunities as categories, two trends played out and two didn't. I don't know if that was like known a priori, but it's interesting to look back at. Yeah, two didn't do so. Two categories didn't do so well, and I would say that I don't feel like value-based healthcare has made a lot of movement in the last 3 years. I don't think there's been some big shift around that.
Yeah. So if you wrote the post today, would it be more or less pretty similar of, hey, companies still need to own more of the value chain, and not rely on intermediaries, or would it be, have we seen a lot of that, and your piece would be somewhat different in terms of the challenges or opportunities of building a big health tech company today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big piece that was left out was there's one value chain that's very profitable inside the healthcare industry, which is the life sciences value chain. So there's probably more companies to build within that scheme. But I do, and Nikhil can talk more about it, I think even the companies that are serving the life sciences industries are trying to eat more of that value chain, become their own drug discovery or drug companies, not just simply serve the industry. But I do think the life sciences, like serving the life science industry, is a bit different than serving the payer industry or the provider industry. So I think that's one different component of it that I would look at. I would push even harder on the consumer side. I think the opportunity is bigger than it even was when I described it 3 years ago. I think it's bigger and it's bigger and getting bigger. So I would push a bit more of that. Yeah, ultimately, any consumer opportunity to me is about having more control over the value chain than not working through a payer to access a patient or working through a provider to access a patient, but really doing that on your own. So yeah, I don't know that this could be good or bad. I don't know that I've changed my view on that piece of the equation about value chain control and trying to not get yourself in some kind of weird principal agent problem where intermediaries aren't really that interested in supporting their end users and customers.
I think totally right. Just to chime in really quickly, like I think on the consumer side, the opportunity seems bigger than ever before. There's like a combination of more uninsured and cash pay patients now. We saw the first. I think it's like we saw the first ever rise in the uninsured segment ever this year since Obamacare kicked in, which is crazy. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Medicaid enrollment, getting tougher, no individual mandate, etc. But there's this consumer segment, which is so interesting to watch right now, of people actually paying for cash for a lot of healthcare services. So there's the direct primary care space. There's like the good RXs of the world who've done a great job bringing price transparency into the pharmacy space. So I'm actually really, really interested in that space. I think there's a lot of full stack consumer companies to be built, and we're slowly seeing being built. I mean, to Malay's point, companies like Livongo, again, not going to questionable whether they're an actual digital therapeutics company, et cetera, but a lot of kind of new primary care modalities that are kind of targeting a really specific subpopulation, I think are really interesting. And obviously at TrialSpark, we work really deeply in the life sciences space. So I think that's totally correct around, there's just, I think, more low-hanging fruit for tech to actually basically make the process more efficient. And I think there's a ton of kind of greenfield opportunity for companies to come and improve that process. But the problem is that if you're not taking on risk, or if you're not being a true competitor to the existing incumbents, you're not going to feel the full benefits of using tech if you have to play with all the other, basically play with all the existing legacy systems. Well, like you're basically just backwards integrating at that point, which is not as useful.
Yeah. I want to get into our request for startups, or where we see as the white space. And we talked about two, big categories. We talked about consumer, we talked about life science. Maybe we can start there. How about within consumer? Like, what are we really excited about? What do we think is not yet, been really captured or been, where there's a big company in the space?
I guess I can start first. I think in my head, no one has really nailed the online to offline kind of patient care channel yet. You've seen some kind of like tidbits of this with like One Medical using telemedicine to basically answer kind of low-hanging fruit questions, and they also have their clinics. Crossover bought Sherpa. We've seen kind of bits and pieces of this. But really, like, what does a like true combination primary care look like that combines telemedicine, wearables, and at-home diagnostics, so really properly triage patients, and then escalate them properly to the right domain of care for that level of severity. So I don't think we've really seen the full what the real potential of that looks like. But one of the I think most interesting parts to me is if you look at the Apple Watch study, they basically combined Apple Watch plus a telemedicine consult to then figure out the severity of your disease. You can imagine a world in which consumers basically get alerted, do a telemedicine triage, are kind of escalated maybe to a higher sensitivity test, and then basically determined if they really need to go to a hospital or not. I just really don't think we've seen the true benefits of telemedicine yet in the U.S. You can even look to some other countries that maybe have done this slightly better as potential examples of what telemedicine could look like. If you look at places like China, etc., their virtual care to in-person care kind of system has so much more emphasis on the virtual care. So I still think we haven't quite seen the benefits of telemedicine here.
I mean, I think I would. I would definitely echo that. Probably the flavor that I would put on it that's maybe similar but slightly different. I tend to think a lot about how the form of medicine that's being practiced today will have to move pretty far to the edge, like much closer to where the patient is. And we talk about the patient knowing before the doctor does, and the doctor calling you, not you sort of calling the doctor. And I do think that's part of that is telemedicine, but probably what I equate it to more is, as medical information came online, it was really, for lack of a better term, democratizing. It was the first time you could actually, as an individual, feel something, type it into a search engine and potentially get a result. And honestly, here we are 20, 25 years later, and it's still basically the same. When I want to get information about my health, I type it into Google, I type my symptoms in, and now there's a knowledge graph card. WebMD is probably, pretty far de-ranked now, but that's the basics of it. And it's this sort of what I would describe as really accessible. It's obviously free, you can get it for no cost. So it's ubiquitous, anywhere you have an internet connected device, but it's extremely unreliable. It's not personalized in any way. And I think the biggest thing that feels missing is where is the step change on that? Now my own information has been indexed, my own data about my health has been indexed, and I'm able to figure out what's going on with me. And I'm glad Nikhil brought up, sort of the Apple Watch. That's sort of one of these first examples of a person, an individual, using a consumer grade, highly accessible device and getting deeply personalized, clinically relevant, and I would argue actionable information delivered to them before their physician gets it. And to me, that is the beginning of what that next wave looks like. And we haven't really seen a company that is trying to, just like we sort of index medical information and put it on the internet, but what about indexing our own health data? And I don't mean our health records. I mean everything we can sort of know about ourselves, or just health records, and surfacing that to us before we have to go into a clinic or into a hospital. And I think telemedicine is a big component of how we'll triage and treat those things, but not the sort of sole component of it.
Yeah, it's really moving from this reactive care model to a proactive care model, right? Where it's just kind of insane to think about the fact that we basically wait till we physically feel sick before we go see the doctor. That just makes no sense. And add a little bit to the Apple Watch thing. Another kind of trend in consumer healthcare that I think is important is kind of embedding healthcare into these processes, tools, and places that we already go, so that the friction is just way lower to engage in health services when we need them. I love that these retailers are getting more involved in healthcare. I think that's smart. I think that's awesome. And it makes it way more accessible for people to actually go get services when they need to. They don't have to go create a standalone clinic somewhere else and carve out time out of their schedule. If you need primary care at the very least, it should be accessible to people in a form that is the lowest friction way possible. And that can be embedded in a watch that we were already buying, and it's not a healthcare device. It just happens to do healthcare stuff. You're going to Walmart. It's not a healthcare place. It's a grocery store. It happens to have healthcare stuff. My favorite study from the last few years was the barbershop heart failure study, where you put in a pharmacist to screen people in predominantly African-American neighborhoods who are at risk for cardiovascular disease because they're already there, right? It's just by reducing these barriers to going to see a doctor. I think we'll see real consumer kind of participation in their healthcare.
And so what, for people who want to build companies in consumer healthcare, what else, where else would you point them? Like what makes sense as a wedge or an entry point or opportunities?
One area that I think is really interesting, it's still like pretty small, but I still think it's interesting, is the direct primary care space is kind of this like, and for those who don't know, it's basically people who are paying a cash pay retainer to a primary care physician, and then the primary care physician essentially acts as kind of like your Sherpa into the healthcare world, right? And it's this interesting combination of consumerism as well as reducing the information asymmetry by actually having a doctor on your side to help you assess things. And these businesses like actually operate with normal customer acquisition cost, lifetime value equations that I think it's very rare in the healthcare system. So basically, by using these direct primary care companies or direct primary care clinics, rather, you kind of have both access to a consumer as well as a physician to understand basically the needs of either or. So that's a space that I think is actually super interesting and is a great wedge, I think, to quite a few consumers.
Yeah, and I think concierge medicine in general is super interesting. I mean, I think if you look at the price points, it's something like a One Medical at 150 to 200 a year, and then something like Forward at 1,500 a year, and Jordan Schlane and Select Medical at like 50,000 a year. There's one core experience everyone seems to be paying for, which is the right to get their doctor's phone number. I mean, it's like a lot of money, but that's like fundamentally what it is. And probably as you go up the stack, like a willingness to say yes to different problems, like you can text your doctor at Forward and say like, hey, I want a CGM device and I'm at Foreman prescription, and they're like, no problem. They don't know whether you have diabetes or anything, but you want anti-aging and you want to be on a keto diet. So all of a sudden you can get, sort of access to these things. And I find that, interesting in the sense that people are looking for, as Nikhil was saying, like lower barriers, lower friction ways to interact with the healthcare system, get it a bit more on demand. So I would be surprised if there aren't sort of Netflix, Spotify style subscriptions, $8 to $15 a month that people pay to gain access to be able to sort of text a doctor and transact with them, something pretty lightweight. I don't think things like, sort of your super health concierge that will solve any problem for you in the healthcare system, research problems or negotiate bills with your insurance companies, like that stuff, I don't think scales very well. But the idea of getting like sort of information, healthcare information out of a doctor or getting prescribing out of a doctor for sort of 8 to 15 a month is fascinating to me. I also think that the other area, I don't know that it's a space that's untapped now, but I'm really interested in is like what companies like QBio are doing. And I've seen a couple other imaging related clinics. What struck me about that space is that we go, almost our whole lives until something pretty bad happens to ever have a view inside of our body, which seems pretty crazy. And the cost of doing imaging and what they might be able to find and detect, I think, there is a reasonable argument that some of those things are consumer services. Like if they hung a billboard talking about the things that you might be able to detect early, a lot of people are going to have sort of demand for those types of services. So I think there's still a big underserved market, probably in the, I don't know, upper third, for folks, upper third from an income perspective, like that hasn't really been tapped into. We're mostly just still like sitting with our insurance, mostly just sitting with our primary care physician, and there's still like quite a bit more demand for healthcare services.
Yeah, as a quick aside and funny story, I got an MRI done for something completely unrelated. I was having migraines for a bit and discovered through the MRI of my head that I've had a deviated septum basically my entire life. I've just never been in an MRI before. And yeah, I was like, oh, that explains a lot.
Well, that's crazy if you think about it, because MRI is actually a pretty inexpensive technology. It is completely safe. There's like nothing that it will do to you. I mean, the contraindications are obviously like having metal implants in you, yet your insurance company fights vehemently against you ever getting one of those things. And they're not. I mean, we have a lot in America, but it's still not an accessible technology, which is nuts. Like how long could you go without the doctor ever seeing inside of your body.
Yeah,
it's pretty crazy.
MRIs are like the case study on why the economics of healthcare are so messed up, because it's this like basically commodity procedure machine. It's the same machine in almost every MRI imaging center, and yet somehow the one in the hospital costs like $10,000, and the one 2 blocks away costs like $1,000, which it's just the price variance is totally insane for a commodity procedure.
Yeah. Let's also talk a bit about life sciences. So first, Malay, maybe you can talk about, as you were mentioning, what you didn't say in your piece, how life sciences is different than healthcare IT in terms of investing or building a company within, or just understanding how that works. And then we can talk about where we're excited and where people should look to build and invest.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes it's a bit overlooked. Obviously, not in today's media environment. There's a lot of scrutiny on drug companies, but if you look at it from sort of a profit pooling perspective, even though it's maybe 10 to 15% of the healthcare system, it's probably equivalent of like all the profits hospitals make. Drug companies probably make more, like the same or more, even though they're a much smaller fraction of overall spending. So in general, like number one, they're extraordinarily rich companies. And then two, I would say the other big opportunity has been that they're heavily intermediated. So they leak on the commercial side. So selling drugs, they lose 30 cents on the dollar to distribution middlemen. And I would guess that on the sort of like clinical development, like the whole process of connecting to potential participants in a study and pulling data out of them to describe or better characterize the benefits and risks of their product, they leak about 60 cents on the dollar there to middlemen like CROs. And so I think it's just been this very ripe opportunity for more efficiency with customers that have pretty big value on the other side of it, because of the business model of drugs, having these kind of protected IP assets that they charge extraordinarily high gross margins for. On the products being heavily intermediated almost in every aspect of their value chain. So it seems to have been a more attractive, opportunity space than going after like payers or providers from like where you want to deploy software technologies.
And how, for entrepreneurs who are looking to build there, where do you think is a wedge or entry point or opportunity in terms of what might you like to see someone do there?
I think there's probably like a ton of them. I mean, life sciences are super, super complex. I would say like one area I've become more interested in is the entire decision-making process around how we choose which assets get developed and then eventually marketed. There's many more potential molecules sort of out there, like more supply than there is demand and capacity to pull them through from a clinical development perspective. So you have this very, very long tail of pharmaceutical and biotech companies who are sort of single asset companies. They're pulling this asset along using public or private, public meaning like government or academic funding or some private capital, pull them along and hoping, they all show up at JPM in January and these hotel floors to negotiate deals to sell those assets off to some of the larger drug companies that have the funding to pull them through clinical development. And that whole decision-making process around which assets to actually pull in and then whether to progress them or not, I find to be, now that I've been a little bit more engaged on the clinical development side, to be one of the most complex areas. It seems too multimodal from a decision-making standpoint to assume that human beings are actually making good and rational decisions. I'll share one anecdote of something we were looking at Evidation. I think Nikhil actually tweeted about this, of like the number of physician assessments that are done in very crude ways and should be automated or potentially looked at differently. Evidation is really interested in sensor and objective data. So we were looking at something in the ALS space, and let's just say within a clinical trial, due to the nature of ALS, you're going to maybe get 6 to 8 data points per patient. You bring them in monthly, and it's a progressive disorder that ends in death. So you don't have a lot of time with the patient. And if you look at the sort of gold standard measure, this functional rating scale, ALS, functional rating scale, ALS, FRS, which has a few different components, but essentially you ask the patient to come in the clinic and they perform a series of things, and then we score it and they go on. And that's the whole game. That's the scorecard for whether the drug gets approved or not. Well, we looked at the data in a clinical study related to, here were the physician assessments done in the clinic, but the people were wearing sensors on and around their clinic visits. And if you look at the intraday variability in those measurements, so we map them to look at like, is their performance better or worse at different times during the day? And then you look at the interday sort of performance, reliability of that using objective sensor data. I mean, it turns out that it's probably just luck is all it amounts to, is when did the patient actually come into the clinic? Like what hour they came in because of the high degree of intraday variation, or what day did they come in the clinic due to an even higher amount of intraday variation, which I don't know that I understood before, of like, what is the role of sort of luck and chance in the outcomes of these studies. And we can only like look back at some of that data. And so the thing I've been interested in, like my request for sort of startups, and an area I've been pushing people into, it's not our space at Evidation, with drug companies are actually sitting on a tremendous amount of clinical trial data. It's kind of ridiculous how many assets have been looked at, developed, partially developed, the amount of data they collect per sort of trial. I would push companies to think about like push a startup to work actually with pharmaceutical companies to gain access to some of that data and try to help with, I hate to say this, but honestly, like AI-based decision making to help guide. I think humans still need to be there to help with it. But the tactics around that and how we make and structure those decisions seem relatively broken to me. Not really relying upon the vast amounts of data that are actually out there. And it's because I look back at this and I see just the absolute amount of luck that plays this role. But those endpoints might turn out to be like highly correlated with failure, as an example of like the type of data that I think could be useful as companies start to try to make better decisions in this space. That would be, one area I think is interesting and would love for somebody to look at.
Yeah, just to jump in there, obviously, because like we are a new CRO, so I've obviously spent a lot of time looking at this stuff. One thing to Malay's point is if you think about AI in life sciences versus AI, I think more in the payer provider space. This is obviously very generalized, but I think a lot of companies that are in the payer provider space are like in some capacity basically trying to replicate some existing process and just like automate it essentially, right? Like, how do we do this thing that a human used to do, but make it totally automated? Versus in the life sciences space, the just sheer amount of data that is available to people means that you're actually like allowing for new types of analyses that just straight up could not be done by a human being beforehand. It's not even something where you're trying to replace a person. It's literally like, oh, we now can derive very new types of insights because we now have the tools to like do very like massive scale amounts of analysis. So it's kind of two different ball games a little bit. And then to the point around clinical trials and endpoints, I mean, if you think about the amount of variability just in a normal patient visit, I mean, it's basically amplified in a clinical trial because you're concentrated in way fewer number of physicians who are actually doing it. There's a lot more kind of, like I said, intraday variability, and we're really just limited to what we see in the clinic currently. And so there's a lot of room for improvement of monitoring patients while they're on a trial outside of the trial. And one thing that our kind of clinical trial offering looks at is, can you add some novel digital endpoints by adding things like wearables or like gait detection or dyskinesia monitoring, or a lot of different things where, that's like really where the quality of life changes are happening, is in the patient's day-to-day life. But in a clinical trial, you're not really monitoring that as much. It's what can you measure in the office itself, which obviously there are like objective things you look at in the form of how the disease is actually changing. But there's a lot of stuff that are helping patients actually in their homes that we don't measure as well. And I think there's a kind of open opportunity there and obviously we're trying to capitalize on that. And we're also seeing this with Google Baseline and a lot of other companies that are doing a lot more home monitoring in the form of research. But I think there's still so much more space there. And then one more area in the life sciences space, I think just getting more patients involved earlier in the process of the clinical trial itself. So protocol design through the entire actual engagement itself, I think, is really important. I'm pretty excited for a lot of these companies that are helping connect patients with more rare disease, rare types of cancers, etc., with trials, because I think there's a lot more specificity we can get from a patient's disease to match them to the correct trial that we just haven't really explored as much yet.
Do you think there are opportunities to build better PBMs? Is that a startup opportunity you're excited about?
Honestly, it's hard for me to see the business of a PBM, at least a standalone PBM, exist in the future. It just it just boggles my mind that this even exists as a business today. It's hard to see what value a standalone PBM would provide in this day and age. I think a lot of we obviously saw a rash of acquisitions in the PBM space, and now I don't even think there are any independent, real formidable independent PBMs anymore. And I think if there's the lowest hanging fruit for Amazon to go after, it would be pharmacy supply chain, which basically removes the PBM concept completely. We don't really, and I think in the age of the internet, the need for someone to do negotiating on behalf of pharmacies and people, etc., with pretty black box techniques it's hard to see that actually existing in the future.
I think sometimes it can be constraining or a little bit myopic too, and we sort of describe things as is it worth building a PBM? I try to think about it more from the standpoint of what are still the unsolved problems in sort of the supply chain. And I don't know if it will be, quote, a PBM or it'll be a pharmacy or some other newly described entity. But, two of, I would say, the core problems still in that value chain. Number one, drug companies still make money when they ship a product from their manufacturing facility, from a warehouse to a wholesaler. So it's moving at warehouse to warehouse. That's when the dollars flow to them, and there's rebating and all that other stuff. But fundamentally, they're paid when they move product. And I don't think that's the future of drugs. Drugs need to be measured just like every other producer or supplier in the healthcare system. Does the drug work or not? And if it works, we pay for it. And if it doesn't work, we're not paying for it. And it's your job to sort of get a clean, good label on your drug and get it to the right patients. But I would say today, no PBM has an ability to measure that data or adjudicate that type of contract. And so that feels like a big missing gap to me, is if we want drug companies to have more skin in the game, to take more risk, to really guarantee that the drug that they've gotten approved and it has this label, it has these claimed benefits, whether it makes it or not, something has to exist in that space. So I think that's one. I think the other one is that there's very little feedback and loops back to even just beginning with the doctors, the people who prescribe drugs to people. If you're a doctor and you prescribe drugs to your patient, you don't even know if they pick them up, much less if they take them. And most doctors you talk to are all this new stuff is cool, but I wish the patients would just do what I ask them. I just wish most of my patients would do the thing that I tell them, and they don't even know those types of basics. So I think, unfortunately, we have a lot of people who know the answers to these questions, but they choose not to serve, other stakeholders. So those are two examples of problems I still see in the supply chain. And I don't know whether, quote, it means a new PBM. I don't know, but there should be entities that exist that are doing things, I think, a bit differently than are being done today. I don't think we needed some new entrant to just take a little less spread. If the spread is 15 cents, having somebody come in and take 10 cents doesn't feel that interesting or impactful to me, of giving a nickel back, 2.5 cents to consumers and 2.5 cents to the drug companies doesn't feel that interesting to me.
Yeah. Having analyzed that value chain, is there anything else, going back to analyzing through the value chain of clinical trials work, that you noticed are sort of unique opportunities for companies to exist?
My honest answer is I looked at probably just under 100 companies a couple of years ago, from sort of the site startup to recruiting, enrollment, the participant management, all the sort of e-clinical kind of software, and then the monitoring stuff. And I think it's hard to build really valuable material businesses sitting in one place in that sort of like chain, ultimately because you don't control enough of the trial, sort of end to end to influence it. Recruiting is a good example of something where if you look at sort of the length of the recruiting period, there's these terms known as like first patient in and last patient in. And so even if you are really, really good at it at your, like it's a 25 site trial and your site's really good at it and you're only given so much quota, or we need like a multi-site trial, we need some degree of diversity, or your country is really good at it and another country in a global trial is not, you're actually not moving the needle. Like you're not actually making the system work any better. And so I think there's all these companies that believe, hey, there's this really, really difficult part of the value chain and I think I'm solving it, but aren't actually solving the whole problem. And so probably the more interesting companies, I'm just going to tee this one right up for Nikhil, are trying to take more control of that loop and value chain. And, I think a company like Metadata, they built an EDC business. It was profitable, valuable. I think Viva is, one of the companies from, my post 3 years ago that's gone from like a $5 billion company to a $20 or $25 billion company and doesn't look any signs of slowing down. They're working in sort of that e-clinical space now. Those feel more like exceptions to building large, companies in this space rather than sort of the rule. They emerged at a time when they were just beginning that transition from paper to electronic, and they happened to move some of that electronic stuff into the cloud, which I don't know if those opportunities are going to, I don't know if those opportunities are going to exist again. It's up to say, I could definitely be wrong, but it doesn't seem to me that's where the opportunity lies. I think pharma companies need people who have way more control over the value chain, the flow of people, the flow of information, to help them drive improvements and efficiencies in their trials. Not just like the ones that they're working on today, but the ones that they're going to work on sort of in the future.
I'm wondering if I should just take this alley-oop and just dunk it straight, or yeah. So I mean, yeah, I think that's totally correct. Like the low-hanging fruit is probably over. It's funny because TrialSpark started as a patient recruitment business also. And then you realize very quickly that if you're recruiting patients and then they go to the sites, they just totally drop off unless you actually can run the site as well. So for us, it was real, starting, I think it's like a lot of companies in the healthcare space who start at that kind of like easier entry point, higher margin, et cetera, and then realize that you're not actually capturing the value or actually like making the system any better if you, for as soon as you hit the like existing legacy healthcare system, all efficiencies basically drop unless you keep going down that stack. So for us, it was, okay, I guess we need to be the sites as well. And so when you combine the digital recruitment with the sites, it looks very different. But really for us, the goal is just, how do we get more people into trials just generally, right? Like trials should become a much better part of the standard of care and just like another option for patients to choose if they so want. Right now, a agonizingly small number of people are aware of trials or take part in trials or even know that that's an option for them. And there's some pretty messed up incentives that kind of prevent that from happening. If you're a physician and there's a trial happening, it's not in your clinic, you might potentially lose that patient. So it's not necessarily in your best interest to, make the patient super aware of this. So for us, we're basically trying to make it as accessible for patients to just take part in trial. Again, like this whole theme has just been lowering friction, lowering the barriers to entry for a patient to do the next thing. If you bring clinical trials to a patient's doctor and basically say like, hey, this is another treatment option for you, you can get more patients into the trial. For drug companies, a big part of this is literally just, can we get enough patients to even meet the criteria that we're setting? And there's this kind of like interesting tension that exists between, hey, we were looking for like a really specific kind of patient for this drug. So it's what's called the inclusion-exclusion criteria. We're looking for a patient that looks really specifically like this, but the more specific you get, obviously the harder it is to find those patients, right? So in theory, if you just expand the pool of patient accessibility into trials, you might actually find more patients that either fit that criteria, or you might just have more patients generally, so your statistical significance at the end is more powerful. But the goal is literally just, okay, we need to make it easier for patients to get into trials. For us, that's, okay, let's go to the local physician's clinic, turn them into a clinical trial site. Now, instead of traveling like 3 hours to go to an academic medical center to take part in a clinical trial, we're with your current physician, we're with a physician that's maybe 30 minutes away from you, et cetera. And that's just like that's like an infrastructure business. Like we're building something that is obviously very, very capital intensive to build, but we are taking the entire value chain of the clinical trial because we think that's really the only way to like truly push the needle on cost in this space.
I want to now transition into our long short segment of the podcast. So I'm going to give you guys a bunch of categories, but first I want you guys to suggest one long and one short that you have. It could be sort of a sector or subsector that you don't see lots of companies emerging out of, or that you do if you're long, that we haven't yet discussed, or something in the broader industry that you think should be mentioned.
I'm long. I think we've already talked about it. I'm long more accessible imaging. So MRI, ultrasound, the sort of Qs or Butterflies, Bay Labs, or whatever their new name is of the world. So I would say I'm long those technologies. They've been around a while, but most of us haven't seen them. And so I think our sort of exposure and ability to gain access to those technologies, I think that there's they're very safe. Number one, and two, we haven't really had much access to them. So I'm long that space. I'm short home sort of like commodity blood testing. So if it's the same test I can get done at local Quest and LabCorp, I would say I'm short all these companies that are shipping the kit in the mail and ask me to send blood back for whatever reason, whether it's sort of food allergies or fertility. I'm short all that stuff because the tests are available like widely, and all of us have always had accessibility to them. So yeah, I'm short that space.
I would say that I'll start with the short. I'm short, I guess they're both related to each other, but I'm short massive hospital and provider systems right now. I think we've reached peak consolidation, and it's kind of, we're ready to see, I think, like lower overhead versions of care delivery that large hospitals are kind of, I think we're ready to see basically the unbundling of a lot of these large hospitals. I think if you look at North Carolina, kind of an interesting battleground for this, where now physicians are actually seceding away from the major hospital system. So very excited to watch that. And then long, enabling those physicians to become independent. I think the only way you can actually bring the cost of healthcare services down is by creating a more competitive landscape for the services part of this business, which, people forget this, but the most expensive part of healthcare is labor. It's not even close compared to everything else. And I think one of the only ways you can make this system work is by making it more possible for physicians to become independent again, and finding ways for them to stay independent, create maybe lower cost models of running a practice and being closer to their patients, etc. And also like handling their back office, practice management, claims, all that kind of stuff. Like I think we need to find ways for physicians to really get closer to their patients and want to work to retain them and manage their care better. So yeah, two sides of the same coin, but I really want to see the hospital system landscape change.
And is there anything else you'd add to if we had an anti-request for startups that you've seen so many of them, you just don't see it playing out? Anything else you'd add that we haven't discussed?
I guess I could take the first stab at this. It's funny because it's almost become a meme to see a person go from like a tech company to like entering healthcare and seeing their like train of thought as they try to fix the system, where it's, hey, the problem is electronic medical records. What we need to do is build a new electronic medical record, a new personal health record. And like the reality is like that's probably not the best point of entry at this point. And then they say, hey, we like need to sell to employers. They're the people who are, controlling all the dollars. And like, that's also not the way to do it. I'm really short. I guess like I'd really like to see less companies targeting the self-insured employer space personally. I just think that the future of this country's healthcare system has to have less employer involvement, not more. I think that's like a really, really bad dynamic for the system, and want to see people find other forms of reimbursement that are not self-insured employers.
I agree with Nikhil. I mean, I think that space is kind of will end up being a pretty significant bloodbath, like not as bad as provider IT, but that many companies have been sort of guided into the employer market, but won't be able to build large businesses. And the ones that do sort of like have gotten out, I think will become, some consolidators of that. I don't personally see like employers out of the healthcare business anytime sort of in the near term, but I do find the B2B2C models that are very employer driven, like not interesting, probably not the thing to pitch me. The other space, I feel like I just keep seeing, the same company over and over again. It's like sort of care coordinator workflow tools. It's these kind of super messaging apps that are like omni-channel patient relationship management apps. And they kind of cycle through like selling to ACOs, then selling to insurance companies, then selling to like startup companies. I've seen a lot of different forms and flavors of that. And I'm still like trying to figure out how so many people get sort of turned onto that problem. And then the other one, like I think all these online pill companies had sort of emerged. And the one I don't know if like somebody had the idea originally and then pitched too many VCs, but menopause, I've seen like 6 or 7 now companies wanting to do sort of online menopause. And that's to say nothing of sort of the problem or the unmet need. I was just sort of shocked to see them all within probably like a 6-month period. I saw, I think, yeah, 5 or 6 different companies going after that space.
Do you think there will be a big winner there
in menopause?
Yeah.
I mean, it might be worth a whole thread of discussion here of like, what is the moat around some of these online pharmacy companies? Like, does it naturally lend itself to winner takes all, and why? I don't have a thesis for that. Again, I don't know everything, not the smartest person out there, but like, I couldn't build one of like why that space is, anything more than the moat being like a consumer brand. It's hard to see what, sort of online prescribing. Like it feels like selling shoes online. I'm not sure.
And would companies like Nurex or Pill Club or something?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of them are, working on different flavors of business model and different forms of like long-term relationships with patients. But it's just not clear to me like why one has to win. Like why it's a, sort of winner takes all situation. But the market also, I mean, for something like birth control is unreasonably large. So if you're asking like, could somebody build a big company? I think the answer is, yeah, I think the answer is yes. Whether they can hold that position, I don't know. It's not clear to me.
So, Malay, Bill Gurley a couple years ago at this point had this blog post about why he's now excited about. You guys both smiling. Why he's now excited about healthcare. What do you think were the lessons? And you guys have a co-investment in Solve. What do you think were the lessons there, or did he get, or was sort of misunderstood a little bit, or could have been? And obviously, he was new to it. But what would you comment there in terms of what was interesting?
I mean, I don't know what his thinking is. I'm not going to like pretend like I do. I would just say probably the hardest lesson, and Nikhil and I had met up recently and we're talking about this, like the pace of healthcare is just really slow. So when you think you have the sort of timing down, you probably need to add a few years. And Nikhil and I were joking that like we could leave healthcare for 10 years and come back and it would be fine. Like healthcare is still going to be here. There's still going to be like a lot of opportunity to improve it. And in fact, it should get easier over time, which, like Nikhil was saying at the beginning and his, presentation on that, like I'm so in agreement about the idea that things are getting easier and there is sort of positive progress. But I think, how quickly things actually tend to move I think has probably been slower. I think this consumerism trend is like absolutely sort of real. And if if you had done an investment in different areas of consumer healthcare, you might think like, well, I really caught the tiger by the tail. Like I think a lot of the HIMSS investors feel they made an investment where they caught the consumerism trend, right on. Other areas might have looked right, but were less right. But I think in general, like the timing of these trend shifts has been probably more challenging for people. Like things develop slowly. I think that's the case. I look at everything we sort of did at Rock Health, and everything was too, too early, and a lot of companies having to forge business models and stay alive that are actually getting healthier and healthier if they've been able to stick around. But it's hard. I think the timing is really getting the timing right is challenging, and then having the patience for it also is tricky. So that's I would guess it's probably just been not as forget explosive, just not even as growth oriented as most investors would want coming in the space.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the other thing is also it's really hard to just deploy the exact same business model from like tech and port it over to healthcare. I think a lot of people look for comparables when they're like, oh, I want to build, this tech company, but for healthcare, like Shopify for X or whatever. I think the reality is like, because the purchasing behavior is very different, et cetera. Like almost every company I've seen has in some way, shape, or form included a services aspect to their business, because the pure software part is really difficult, even for consumers, et cetera. Like you really need to have a little bit more hand holding, a little bit more concierge. Like people are not going to be like 100% informed purchasers in a lot of these cases. And so, and the other thing is also like it's way harder to unbundle anything in this space, because in a lot of cases, people just don't want to deal with point solutions. They really just want to like have with the exception of consumers, which I actually think is like the area where we're starting to see a lot of unbundling. But I think a lot of people are generally like to have their holistic healthcare taken care of / enterprise side, at least. Like it's really hard to kind of like get them to change their ways.
I think I'll probably take like a disagree, since Nikhil and I have been agreeing too much. Of like I just think like the bundling and unbundling goes in cycles. So we want these sort of like best in class solutions because the payers have sort of aggregated and everything's sort of average crappy. And so then these specialists come in and they do that. And then all of a sudden now I'm an employer and I'm staring at 100 point solutions. So I go and look for somebody to re-aggregate and rebundle it. So I feel like we're in that part of the cycle now where so many point solutions emerge, and some of them were able to get in and escape even within the enterprise side. I think Livongo is like a good example of somebody who went in as a point solution. I'm a connected glucometer. I'm doing diabetes. They slowly expanded just before going public, and now they'll have the cap to sort of start consolidating and be that aggregator of different disease solutions, to the employer. So some of that just feels a little bit like sort of cyclicality to me. I think like a lot of what we were thinking about in terms of like Solve is a good a good example of a company, and I can't speak for the benchmark side of it, but having worked with them early on and then doing the deal at Greylock too, I actually think most of the thesis has been absolutely right, which was really about a shift to convenient care and where are those people, where do they live, and all of that has been exactly right and true. Like I think the idea of lower barriers, people wanting to access highly convenient care, not really having a primary care physician or a major medical home, and especially that use amongst sort of parents. Like many of those trends have actually played out. What I think is always really, really challenging in the healthcare space is like, what is a well thought through business model that enables you to capture that value? But I think from a sort of like, where was the market going, that piece is played out, reasonably well. But I think like the biggest challenge with many of these companies, and it's not, I'm not speaking of Solve specifically, but just a lot of healthcare businesses, once you've sort of created an attraction point or some consumer demand and adoption, like what is the thoughtful business model you build around that? And probably like the best possible example of that, of somebody hitting a trend squarely on the nose and making a ton of money doing it. It's like GoodRx. Price of drugs became too high. People were on cash pay, high deductibles. They saw all this weird pricing arbitrage in the market, and they were able to kind of get in with a really simple solution for consumers, grow consumer adoption and brand, and had the business model to back it up. I've not seen anything, like that. I think that's was a very unique company, but I'm guessing there'll be more of those types of opportunities. It's just, I think, hard to find them, even when you manage to get distribution and traction, which is one of the most challenging things to do in the health space. It's still not easy to have like a business model. I think that's where, like, I would agree with Nikhil, like taking a tech business model and just lumping it on to the healthcare space is challenging. Like it's not so easy. Like there was like marketplaces are fascinating, and sort of like transactional fees. It was literally just like 2 weeks ago that OIG finally issued an opinion to ZocDoc allowing them to charge, a booking fee. Like, so you couldn't even have like a similar marketplace, like an exactly similar marketplace business model. You couldn't do promoted listings. Things like that were considered against the law. And it took them, I don't know, they've been around for over 10 years to actually get that opinion. But it's now, a bigger and more wide open game for things like that.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and just say, well, I think one of the big kind of points that Malay's bringing up is also, I can't stress enough how important customer segmentation is in healthcare, because people have really, really differing health needs, right? There are people who have like basically just need commodity care, and for like their X problem, they don't really care which physician they see. They just need to get it done. And that's like entirely convenience and price. That's all they care about. Like, what are they paying out of pocket? How fast can they do it, etc. Then on the other side, if you have people who have like a very specific disease or a recurring chronic condition that has had a high unmet need, etc., they develop very strong relationships with their specialist of choice, and that specialist does a lot of the things that their PCP does. So I think for companies that are tackling this, sometimes what happens, I think, is they try to create a horizontal solution that's sort of designed to try and treat every patient's needs. But really, I think it's you have to do strong customer segmentation, figure out like what are the issues this group is facing from end to end, and just really target that group, and then move down the customer journey of just that one specific person, rather than suddenly trying to like expand to all of healthcare, which I think tends to be a fatal mistake.
Was Stitch, I think, the Slack for doctors, is that an example of imposing a business model from tech onto healthcare? I'm curious, I guess that is a provider IT company. You mentioned you're dubious of provider IT companies. What would need to be true for you to be excited about one? Or like what type of world could that be?
I think this is exactly the care coordination stuff you were talking about.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think the world would have to we would have to start over with providers. Like, I'm not sure. Like, maybe one that serves, a provider IT company that is serving these modern providers. Getting back to Nikhil's earlier point of like, is it possible now that some of these quote, like smaller, like non-healthcare incumbents are getting to a point and like a scale where you can actually serve them and solve problems for them? So I would be interested in a business that's able to serve those companies. I mean, I think one area that's come up, a lot. There was a company in the last YC class, is billing is like a good example. And I won't talk about any specific companies, but I just know, like, looking at the Rock Health portfolio, virtually every company built their own billing solutions to be able to, sort of manage that. Everybody was working with employers and working with payers. They built a billing solution. And now, are there enough sort of like new style providers to kind of service that? So I would guess, if I was going to do something in the provider, like invest in stuff in the provider IT space, it would probably be serving like the next generation of providers rather than anything within the legacy generation.
Yeah, I think I think it'd have to be a wedge into some more interesting, larger platform business rather than trying to like slog it out and go provider to provider and sell into it. Like, I'm curious to watch kind of a lot of these like voice documentation companies, because I think they solve a really specific pain point for physicians around documenting their visits. But there's an interesting world in where that just becomes a wedge into building a more interesting data platform for people to build on top of, right? Like that. Like I think there are a few documentation companies that I think would be interesting, but I haven't seen one yet that also is like 100% great at like replacing the existing documenting process, which then kind of makes it for naught if they have to like check over the notes all over again. So, but I think that's a really interesting space.
So there was a moment where people were encouraging sort of this one medical for X, like take build a vertical full stack solution against a disease, and one medical for musculoskeletal, or one medical for women's health. Or what happened to these companies? What do you think about that approach?
I think people misunderstand why One Medical is successful. I think the big thing with One Medical is that they really tapped into the fact that like this is a great perk for employers to offer their employees, because when you go from like one company to another company, it's like literally the same exact questions get asked. It's, hey, does anyone recommend a primary care physician that's under our network, etc. One Medical basically makes that super easy in the sense of like, oh, we have One Medical that's just like going to be the PCP that I use. And it's great that like my information from my last employer to this employer now carries over and I can kind of continue my care. I think what people misunderstand is that, I think, how do I turn this shit off? Sorry. I think what people misunderstand is that it's people are not like willing to like pay these subscriptions just to like have like a commodity access to some like commodity specialist, etc. Right? Like I think there are a few areas where that might be the case. I think primary care, dental, arguably, and then maybe something like physical therapy or therapy are like the few areas where that happens. I'm sorry, my fault. Let me sign out. So I think those are like some of the few areas where that happens, but like building a One Medical for like GI or something like just doesn't make sense to me. It has to be something where there's like a high variance in the quality of brand and like services that are offered. So people are looking for like kind of this like standardized solution. It's got to be something that I think is like a really nice perk that people would offer. And I think it's got to be something where people like would theoretically use it enough that it would even be worthwhile for the employer to offer it as an offering.
I want to say a space, and then you tell me either way you're bullish or bearish on it, or a specific sort of hot take or opportunity you see within it. So for fertility, Malay, you mentioned you're less excited about sort of the consumer tests. Where are we? Maybe unpack that, or where are we excited in fertility, if at all?
I'm excited by what Hallie's doing at Natalist. I think that for most people, like trying to conceive should be a natural, healthy process. Not for everyone, obviously, and I think we should find solutions for that. But a good starting point is one that's based on science and not fear, and helping people through that journey. So I'm pretty excited about what Hallie's doing, which is basically saying like, we're not trying to scam you or scare you. We're trying to just give you the things that for most people, this is the way that it should work. And if it doesn't, then let's like start to revisit that. But to me, it's like sort of a little bit of the difference between fertility and infertility. So that's something I'm, more bullish on. I feel like it's been a little bit tricky to find good investments in the women's health space, in the sense of like feeling like they have like an authentic message that's like very scientifically driven and not sort of fear based.
Yeah. How about on insurance or the payer side? What are sort of what do you think about sort of incumbents in the space, or what do you think about opportunities to build the companies there?
I guess I can start with this one. Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be I think it's like interesting to watch a lot of the Medicare Advantage companies kind of, I mean, now that space has gotten really crowded, and I'm interested to see kind of how these companies choose to differentiate themselves. There's basically there's like almost two parts to it. There's how do you acquire new customers from new Medicare beneficiaries, which is one of the most difficult parts, and hard to tell if tech plays a role there or not, or if it's just adding cool new perks. I mean, I saw Devoted today, for example, offering the Apple Watch and covering that. Like, is that something that is interesting enough to actually attract new Medicare beneficiaries? Like TBD, not totally sure. Or is that something where the tech actually helps reduce something like unnecessary admissions, which is like really where you start seeing cost savings on a per enrollee basis. So I'm curious to just see, and we won't know, I mean, like to the earlier point, the feedback loop here is like 7 to 10 years, right? So we won't know basically for a pretty long time if in aggregate, a lot of these companies where they have like a lot of lives covered are actually using tech in ways that either gets new customers or significantly improves their bottom line. But I'm curious to watch and see how that happens. So that's one area that obviously has gotten a lot of, and also a lot of the rules are changing for next year, for 2020, in terms of what can be covered in the primary care side of things. So I think a lot of companies, both the incumbents as well as new companies, are really looking to figure out cool new like primary care, expanded primary care perks, basically, to make their offerings more attractive. I'm sure we'll start seeing things like groceries and meal kits being covered, and like ride sharing in some capacity to a doctor's office, etc. Like, I think we'll really start seeing the like perks and benefits of Medicare Advantage really take off next year. Really curious if a lot of these newer players actually are an attractive option for new Medicare beneficiaries. I'm not totally sure, but I'm watching. And then I'm kind of interested in seeing, there's like this niche area of like catastrophic plans that have popped up, which I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, some of them seem kind of shady and suspect, but on the other hand, we're seeing this like interesting, almost like new healthcare system being built, where it's like cash pay consumers that use like a direct primary care physician or some PCP, and then just have coverage in the case of some like disastrous event. And that's an area where it feels a little bit more consumer focused, but also at the same time, like I'm not sure how many consumers know exactly what they're buying into. And I feel like there are a lot of shady characters in that space too.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like low benefits plans, there was a reason why we got rid of them under the ACA. They're pretty scummy products where people end up bankrupt. So I don't know exactly which companies you're describing, but I feel like anything that's not covering you is not great, unless you've been ultra clear and transparent. I think with the broader payers, Erik, maybe we discussed this actually on that first podcast a couple years ago. I don't think anything has really changed. So the ones that have been around a little bit longer, like these new startup insurance companies, their growth has slowed down sort of pretty dramatically, like in the MA space. I would say that America deserves better health insurance companies. Like, we deserve better payers. But if you look back at sort of that market and that industry, United became United, Aetna became Aetna, and so on and so forth from consolidation. It was inorganic growth. So there was like a sort of once in a lifetime opportunity to roll up highly fragmented markets. I don't really understand what the weapon from a tech standpoint is for gaining scale and distribution in this space. Like free rides, that's cool. I went on Devoted's website actually after that Apple Watch story came out to look at the benefits list. They already offer those. So you get free ride to the doctor. I'm pretty sure any MA plan can offer the same thing. Like, that's not a point of like defensibility or acquisition. And technically they're not paying for Apple Watches. They're giving you $150 to spend on any wellness thing you want. So it's not just watches, but like if you want Jenny Craig weight loss, they'll pay for that, or Zumba classes, they'll give you $150 to spend, kind of on that stuff. And to me, that's not tech being used to scale sort of the business. I do think they're going to be able to become more margin positive within the regulatory scheme that they have of like being margin capped. But I think they'll be able to, on a unit basis, make more money. Both like their administrative costs will be more efficient due to like tech and everything else they'll use. And I think that they'll actually be, better partners to doctors and be able to, control some of the health spending in ways that other payers can't. But I just don't know. I just don't see them really getting to much scale. I think they're building pretty attractive sort of chassis or platforms. And the big question to me is like, what happens in the intermediate game, and which companies exit and fail, and which ones are kind of left without a dance partner? Because at the end of the day, you're still a payer, and even if you're a high growth payer, you go from like a 0.8 to 9x multiple to like a 1.5x multiple. And I'm not sure that venture is going to feel good at that point. So I'm very interested in, as these companies sort of like grow older, what that intermediate, who gets a dance partner and who's kind of like left trying to grow a small scale health insurance company.
I think the other thing that's so tough in this space is like the regulatory landscape is so in flux here that it's really hard to like really invest in some big bet, etc., and like and hope it takes off. I mean, Oscar is a great example where they really made a bet on like the exchanges early on, and that just turned out to be like, and not necessarily their fault or anything. They really just took a big bet and like didn't plan out the way that they thought. And now we're basically at another kind of election cycle, and it's, everything could totally change once again, right? So if you're a new payer and you're making a bet on a space, there's so much regulatory uncertainty that and capital requirements that it's just hard to see exactly how you would create a massive new payer again right now and like take a big swing with someone willing to do it today.
I'm curious to get a sense for, what are the major bottlenecks that are sort of preventing sort of the gold rush of healthcare companies? For example, like, our mutual friend Sarah Tavel has said that she doesn't invest in healthcare; it's just too complicated. Or like, when is she going to be lining up to she and all the other great investors out there to be allocating venture dollars to healthcare opportunities? Like, what's holding it back, and when can we see it?
I actually, it's funny because I don't think healthcare is as complicated as everyone seems to make it seem. Like, obviously, it's tough to understand maybe if you're like trying to tackle the entire landscape at once. But if you actually spend like a relatively reasonable amount of time, I think you can get up to speed relatively quickly on the space if you just pick a specific segment you're really interested in. And I also don't think it's necessarily venture dollars that it's holding companies back. I mean, anecdotally, have just noticed a lot more tech investors now looking at healthcare as an investable opportunity, just because I think the low-hanging fruit in like pure mobile, pure software, pure et cetera have kind of been tapped out a bit. And so now people are going after these like more legacy industries, complicated problems, et cetera. So I've definitely seen a migration of investors to the space. And frankly, like, I mean, one of the big bottlenecks, which I think is changing right now, has been talent in the space. I think it was really hard to attract smart people or like a lot of ambitious people to healthcare because, there are great jobs in other parts of tech, and this is a space that seems really complicated, and the feedback loops are really long, etc. Now I think you have kind of a lot of people, like talented people, entering the space either because maybe they're disenchanted working at some of the large tech companies. The healthcare is like a more social enterprise industry to work in. There are a lot of people now who are alumni of that first wave of healthcare companies like PillPack, ZocDoc, etc., who are like really bringing the chops of being at the intersection of healthcare and tech, which is, I think, really great. So I think labor, which was like a really big part, or like just smart people entering the space, was, I think, a really big bottleneck. But I think that's actually been changing a lot. That's actually one of the reasons I'm like most bullish on healthcare or digital health right now broadly, is because just the influx of talent has been really impressive. Capital is capital. I don't really think capital has been the constraining factor in the space, candidly. But I think talent, and I think also just, again, going back to this, but like having early adopters being able to like test solutions out has been a huge bottleneck. Like there's a whole layer of like AWS for X in healthcare that is slowly being built right now. that makes it just easier for small companies to start. And I think once that happens, you'll like really see an inflection point in the space.
Yeah, I feel like it's fund by fund and person by person. A couple sort of like big things that it would seem you see investors starting to engage around. I think one, this consumer space starting to take off has brought people to attention of hey, what's going on with, especially with some of the sort of like online pharmacy companies. I think there's been quite a bit of interest in that space. Even Benchmark, they invested in not Sarah, but her partner Erik invested in Dunchling. So I think life sciences is seen as a more ripe and attractive area, and fundamentally that's a vertical SaaS business. Maybe it's not a healthcare business; it's more just hey, life science is a good vertical, and this is a pure SaaS company. I do think the other sort of emerging area, clearly, we haven't touched a lot on it, is just the bio space. There's something certainly happening right now. Forgetting like the venture trends, like we're seeing a lot of innovation in the pure biotech space with the underlying platform technologies around biology. And so, I don't know, I think funds like Andreessen have clearly geared up, hired teams, built dedicated funds for it. CRV has dedicated partners. So I see, a good solid rush probably will come around, that space. But typically, I guess I would expect the traditional tech investors to play on the edges where things look similar, like consumer or like enterprise SaaS, where it's easier to understand the businesses. I think it's right. I mean, the healthcare space has been like doing the deep sort of healthcare provider payer stuff. If you don't have the tool set, sort of for it, some special advantage as an investor, I don't know why you would do it. It's already like hard enough, and there's much easier ways to make money than doing that kind of stuff. So I don't know. I mean, I think, I think bio is an interesting area where people will see like a lot of opportunity, and we'll see a lot more funds there. I think there's some piece of healthcare that's also like kind of related to climate change, where I think we'll see people coming in, and then the rest of it where the sort of like the overlapping areas with traditional tech is where you'll see the most play.
Which part related to climate change?
Like infectious diseases is probably like the, sort of clearest example. The craziest stuff would be, adaptability solutions, even for humans to be able to survive in different, as the climate changes. Like, are there things we could do to, modify our environments where biology could be more, our biology is either better adapted to that environment, or we readapt the environments around our existing biology.
That's super interesting. I never really thought too much about that, but I think infectious disease is also kind of one of these crazy areas where like there's a pretty big market failure too, because creating drugs, etc., for infectious disease is just not really where the money is in a lot of cases. And so you see this like also the one hand societal inefficiency around solving climate change, and then combine that with like the societal inefficiency of not being great at like solving infectious disease, and like that seems actually like a pretty huge issue. Like generally, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and it could be about like drugs for that. So it could be things for us, but it could also be things for the way that we manage crops, or the way that we manage animals, and things that we sort of eat. It just seems like there's a lot of different vectors for infectious disease, and things that we would address using something related to biology. I think food has been a good example of something that's at the intersection of sort of half health, half half bio, or is it half health, half climate change related? I don't know. It's kind of touching on a few different areas.
You mentioned that one mistake we've made is just transposing tech business models onto healthcare. But in bio, it seems that Andreessen and some other funds, you sort of specifically talk about biology as engineering, and you equate building sort of biotech companies with building software companies. Is that going to work in a way that it might not in healthcare? How do you think about that?
and I this is like, I'm like a total novice in this space, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. But I think to your point, one of the really cool things in the last few years has been being able to create these like really tight iterative feedback loops that are kind of getting shorter and shorter in, basically as you run experiments, being able to get results faster, which I think is kind of independent of engineering biology, but just that's like a trend in life sciences that I think is really cool. And I remember distinctly when I used to work in a lab back in the day, how long experiments would take, either because a lot of these processes are really manual, and you have to wait a really long time for them to happen, and then the informatics takes a long time, etc. And now, you have so much like awesome automation in the lab, and the computers have gotten so much better in that time, etc. And so it's been awesome actually to see. And now you have tools like CRISPR, etc., which let you do kind of more like experiments kind of on the fly for cheap. That I think just in general, tightening feedback loops is generally like a pretty good, like if you can figure out a way to do that, is generally a pretty good business, and also like a pretty good sign that you're about to like see a like truly, like Cambrian explosion of new companies, new innovations, etc. So, and you've seen that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think like the labs are more efficient for sure. The loops are tighter. The piece where I would push on a lot is like how much of that ultimately is going to translate into humans. It seems like we reach some complexity that's not quite, perfectly described within those systems, these model systems that are created. And I think Flagship, the Bio Fund, put out like a very lengthy, interesting essay about, the human system is so complex, and typically the way that we study complex systems like this is looking at the emergent properties of the system. So actually like having to model humans rather than our current method. If you think about like things like GWAS, which is let's screen a bunch of people and try to find this one thing and then develop a hypothesis around it. It might just turn out that we've found a lot of the low-hanging fruit there, and now it's time to move on to some of the more complex problems, but we're not going to be able to decode them in the same way. And we have to have more human-oriented models. And then two, rather than trying to start from like sort of quote first principles down at some molecular bio level, that we might have to look at more what are the properties of this system that emerge when we observe humans for long periods of time, and work backward from there. I've been a pretty anti sort of like phenotypic based model approach person. Like I've always been more interested in the fundamental biology, but it seems like it is, we're reaching some limits, and we have to start from more how things express themselves rather than starting from, we're going to decode the fundamental nature of biology. Like we still don't even know how like DNA replicates itself. Like there's so many things that are still mysterious to us. And I'm not sure that we're going to get there as fast as we could by observing these complex systems. And I think to Nikhil's point, like now we have more of the tools on the engineering and the software side to be able to process and manage a lot of that data, and maybe turn it into new ideas for therapeutics. I think I'm bullish about like that space in general. But yeah, I think there's probably a lot of different approaches from the fund perspective of how to attack those spaces.
Yeah. The sort of maybe gearing towards closing here. In technology, we think about incumbents quite a bit, particularly in consumer. We think, hey, it's tough to build something if you're going to compete with Facebook. It's tough to build something if you're going to compete with Amazon. How should we think about incumbents as it relates to startups? Obviously, there are tech companies getting into healthcare, and then there are health incumbents. Are there certain spaces that we've just written off and say, hey, Amazon's going to win that, so unlikely to be big companies, or how should we be thinking about incumbents?
I guess I can take a stab at this. I think the incumbents in every single slice of healthcare have very different behaviors. So, one thing that's kind of surprised me a little bit about the life sciences space is that pharma companies are actually pretty innovative and open to new solutions. Even more so than a lot of biotechs, because they are not single asset dependent. So they think they manage more of like a portfolio of a risk, and so they're actually a little bit more willing to explore and try new solutions. So maybe in that space, it actually makes a lot of sense to go after the incumbents as their initial customers. Versus if you look through the rest of the space, like, okay, are there areas where having some really, really, built out infrastructure gives like an inherent advantage to, XYZ problem they're solving. So if you're like if you're trying to tackle pharmacy, if you're trying to do wholesale pharmacy across the entire US, like, okay, that might not be the best customer segment to figure out, but I don't think it's that different than tech, where it's like, find a customer that has a really specific pain point, you just build for that, and then you kind of like move deeper and deeper down the stack of that pain point and expand from there, right? Like, I think if you try to build like a really horizontal technology that like an incumbent is probably more likely to have the distribution already built in for, like, not going to be as easy for you to crack into. But you find some really niche specific customer segment, find a pain point that clearly is not being solved, you have a pretty big opportunity. I mean, the reality is, like, incumbents in healthcare are so much larger and more like Frankenstein-esque than in like almost any other industry. Like because of just like how much consolidation has happened in the space, you have this like, these companies that are just doing so many things at once, and in a lot of cases not being great at any of them, that like, you can, if you find a specific pain point, like you can build a business there, and you'll figure the rest out once they start paying you.
I don't know, like, yeah, I don't know how to, I think it, like, some of the specifics, like, do matter, as sort of Nikhil said. Just in general, I do think more like, if you're not competing with some incumbents in some way, you're probably not going to be able to build a big company. Like, I don't think that anytime somebody's like, we're making everyone happy, everybody wants to work with us, it's sort of scary to me. I think like somebody needs to feel like they're losing if you're building, an interesting company in the health space.
Yeah, build more challengers. I'm about.
I want to be sensitive to both of your time, so we should wrap soon. Is there any last points or things that we didn't get to discuss that you think are interesting for the listeners should know, or any threads you want to pull before we wrap?
I think people just generally should just be less intimidated by healthcare. I mean, that's like the running theme of my life, is like, how do you make healthcare like more accessible place for people? Because the space is not going to get better unless smart people come and try to like take a stab at it. And I think a lot of people get turned off because they think it's just really like impossible to solve and so much regulatory burden, etc. Like, do really encourage people to take a look deeper into the space, because there's a lot of really meaningful problems to be solved, and a lot of like very interesting businesses and problem sets to tackle. So yeah, I mean, my one piece is more just like, healthcare is not as intimidating as you think it is, and there's a lot of opportunity in the space.
Yeah, I would echo that. I met with an entrepreneur this morning who, came from tech, no healthcare background, has been spending time on like the aging and elderly space for the last few months. And when I met with him this morning, he said it was the most encouraging, talk that he had. I'm not saying that about me, but like literally everyone's been telling him don't work in healthcare that he's been meeting with, which I think is, unfortunate, like to sort of like tell people that it's too complex or too hard. It's not to say that it isn't complex or not hard, but I don't think that we should be trying to like keep people out of it. I think we should be encouraging, best and brightest into the space. I think the one place, Eric, we didn't talk about, but Nikhil touched upon, and was like one of your questions, was just like, like what's kind of like an issue in healthcare that you don't think is talked about enough. And one of our advisors, I think he does a good job of pushing us a lot on like sort of everyone thinks about tech and like tech-based disruptions, or whatever you want to call them, like tech-based innovation in healthcare space. But he pushes a lot to think about like stroke of a pen innovation. So like, where is the regulatory landscape possibly going to change and create an opportunity? Like a good example, in Nikhil's space would be if that idea that we would no longer have to prove that drugs are efficacious in order to put them on the market. We don't have to prove that drugs are safe. it moves the whole balance of the game from sort of this regulated clinical trial environment to a more, quote, unregulated post-market real world environment where getting all those people into those clinical trials would sort of matter less. Or, if they change the laws around how biosimilars sort of come to market, it would dramatically change the way pharma thinks about their products and their modes, IP. So things like that, I think we tend to sometimes underthink the amount of impact simple regulatory changes can make in healthcare. And I don't mean simple, like easy to pass, but they would be literally like a stroke of a pen could upend entire business models overnight. So it's something that's always worth, I think, spending time on. I'm glad like one of our advisors pushes us on it of like, what are those opportunities that could, emerge, or that we should be doing market shaping work around that would deeply benefit our company.
And just to give you a couple minutes there, or if you had a sort of a request for strokes of a pen, any others that come to mind that would be game changing for companies?
I mean, I think the like lowest hanging fruit here is literally just decoupling the employer and health insurance, relationship right now. It's crazy that we're one of the few developed countries in the world where your employer chooses your health insurance plans options for you, and it just totally messes up the market dynamics generally. I'm excited for next year when more of these HRA rules kind of kick in to see if maybe some stuff changes. But this is like one of the should be bipartisan support on both sides because it's the worst of a marketplace and the worst of a regulated area right now, where like employers basically giving their employees dollars to go shop around on a marketplace as opposed to making the decisions for them, I think would be relatively low hanging fruit and like really change how people, I think, interact and purchase healthcare.
The important humane thing to do is to get everybody covered. Like we need to make sure that everyone can access healthcare, but then give them agency, put the money in their hands, like they fund the accounts, the government funds the accounts, whatever it is, but give them agency through money, like spending power, and then agency through data control and ownership of the things that are related to your own health. Those feel like the big pieces to me, like get everyone in and then give them more agency.
Agreed.
A lot of U.S. healthcare issues get blamed on systemic inefficiencies, profiteering, et cetera. Are there ideological differences as a country that make our healthcare uniquely expensive?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like you Reinhardt's covered this many times. It's the prices. Like that's why our healthcare system costs so much. Like it might be true that there are places to get the world's best healthcare, like in this country, but it's I think unequivocal that is not uniformly distributed. Like most people don't have access to that type of healthcare. Like I don't think having the top end of healthcare here is what drives like the quote like systemic inefficiency in the market. I do think there's some false choices we make, like the idea that we have so much choice and there's no care rationing and all of that. It's like, I don't know, man. I just pick up the newspaper and somebody's died from not having access to insulin. Like it's just we're not a country where everyone is getting healthcare sort of services. We're clearly rationing our budget here too. So I don't know. To me, it's not. It doesn't feel like a values or ideological question. It feels like we just do have systematic inefficiency problems that you've said it. It's like labor costs, which are tied up in hospitals and doctors. So to me, that's the place we have to go start to address these things.
And maybe lastly, you if there was anything you could do to rewrite healthcare, we talked about employer, but anything else, if you could rewrite the system or redesign it, any other edits or major changes you'd make?
I mean, I think a big one is like around just data kind of interoperability generally. I think we built basically our health IT infrastructure with providers and payers as like the first entry point into how data should be kind of captured and distributed and created. I think in if we had rebuilt it today, it would look way more like a consumer-driven health record system. So I think figuring out a way to get from here to there is going to be kind of the challenging part, and I think part of it is going to be around giving consumers agency to make their choices and figure out where they're going to pay money, because that's how how kind of infrastructure is going to be rebuilt. But I think we made a mistake in how the EMR kind of systems were rolled out and the incentives at play there that basically prioritized custom building of solutions as opposed to creating platforms. And I think we're still feeling the pain of that now, and hopefully, basically I would rewrite that.
Yeah, I agree. It was a gigantic waste of taxpayer money, a boondoggle, and patient as vector of their own data is, to me, the logical path forward. I'm the custodian and I provision access to the information related to my own health. I think we chatted about the agency of money and agency of data. The last piece I would push is really around antitrust action, looking at these local sort of monopolies that we built in the healthcare system systematically, market by market, and starting to break them apart. Because I just think everyone who's within these local communities is sort of trapped by their local provider systems, and telemedicine, virtual care will play some role in that. But I think we need some additional antitrust activity, even though they're quote nonprofits and everything else. I think there's a lot of bad sort of market behaviors and consolidation that's resulted from our push towards quote value-based care, and ACOs has had some negative market effects on consolidation. I think we have to look at that on the antitrust side.
My guests today have been Nikhil Krishnan from TrialSpark and Malay Gandhi from Evidation Health. Malay, Nikhil, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Thanks, Erik. It was great.
Thanks, Erik.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, guys, for your patience and for doing an epic one with me. I think this will be a hit.
Yeah, excited.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.